Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1234. And we've been learning in Samach yesterday the more broader explanation of the points he's making here. So briefly, what we learned and what I'm going to continue finishing now in Samach and the Maimer Ki Kasher Shamayim, which is posted on the group, which is also an opportunity to remind anyone who's part of this class or listening at some point, if you wanted, we have a WhatsApp group where you're welcome to join, where we post every day's audio class, as well as any updates of schedule changes, and as well as some of the, we'll call the secondary or the accessory memorim that we learn, some of the PDFs. So what we're in the middle of learning is essentially about Chochma in contrast to Bina. The Chochma experience is what I called it, is that when Chochma is impacting a person, which means, what does Chochma mean? He calls it three things: Hanocha Sichlis, the resonance of an idea, the Kavana, Pnimiyas HaKavana Be'etzem Nekudas HaMuskul, the inner intention of that idea. We're talking about the divine idea, of course. And Riyah, a type of visualization where you're experiencing it and be completely absorbed. Like what Riyah impacts a person is that it mesmerizes and what was the word I said yesterday? Captivates the individual. So when you're experiencing the divine through the Chochma lens, its effect is very different than through Bina. In Bina, it's about understanding godliness. You, the person, is using your mind. So yes, you're rising above subjective emotions. You're definitely focusing on godliness. And you're using your mind in a very intense way, as we learned. But there's a person there, a yesh, and the experience is a yesh one, because understanding is yesh. It's an existing experience. It's an experience you can talk about, you can identify, you can define. So even the feelings that it evokes, and it does evoke different contemplations, evoke different feelings, as we spoke, the feelings are very sensed. You sense them. They're very tangible and concrete. Yes, they're on a level of mature intelligence, not just following their own whim, or just their natural inclination, or even intelligence that's guiding them. This is an intelligence that's driving the force, but the midas still remain, as we said, not changed fundamentally from their very natural structure. Chochma, on the other hand, is an experience where you get absorbed in the experience itself, and that effect on midas is very different. First of all, the distinction between chesed and gvura, or love, ava and yira, it's coming from the same experience. It's not like two different contemplations. His chalkus, a structured contemplation. Now I'm thinking about this, now about that. And the effect on the midas is one that there's no hergish. It's not murgish, because you essentially you lose yourself in the experience. Now, in the discussion of ava v'yira that comes from chesed and gvur, and ava v'yira that comes from chochma, he introduced and cited Samach Vav, which was talking about how the Chochma creates bittul. That's its main effect. Bittul, complete sublimation, complete absorption. I'm not using nullification, but nullification can also be used, the same idea. And he used the expression, I'm reading from Ayin Beis now, the yim za bittul be'etzmus v'yovizel apamim b'chinas ava. So yes, from Chochma too, like we said earlier about the Mabul, you could have one idea, one divine experience that brings different emotions. So sometimes ava v'dveikus l'pamim yira, and he used the word dveikus, attachment. And the Hefresh, he said, the difference is if it's an experience only in the mind, or also one that's coming, which then it's in a state of Rotzo, yearning and longing, dveikus, or the hergish is also on the lev. You also feel the experience in the heart, and then it's Shuv, which is the level of yira. That's all he says in Ayin Beis. Samach Vav we learned, and I'm going back to Samach Vav yesterday, he explained what this means. He said, in general, Chochma, because it's bittul, there's no self. Rotzo means there's you, seeking something, feeling or sensing something beyond you, and that's a bina experience, he said. And Chochma is Shuv, because you are where you're not traveling anywhere. You're in the experience itself. And the experience of the divine wants you to make kelim, dira b'tachtein. So it's not a rotze to go somewhere else, to go to a higher state. So even though initially we would think rotze is like higher, because look, someone's yearning, and Shuv is more settled and resolved and relaxed. No, Shuv is more deeper bittul than rotze. So rotze is a bittul that's manifest through expression. And through one thing seeking the creation, the human being, the neshama is seeking to connect to its source. And Shuv is that you're absorbed in the experience itself. It's still not atzmus mamash, he said, ziv ha'ara, but it's the etzem ziv ha'ara, not a reflection. But then he asked the question, and this is the 2 pages that we talked about. Then he asked this question. But other places it says that Chochma also leads to Ava and Rotze. The bottom of page 148 in the pages I posted. He says, he says, Vagam explains elsewhere that from the Riyah of Chochma, you also get a dveikus, because Riyah creates a type of captivation and mesmerize. You're completely clinging to the thing that you're watching, that you're seeing, even deeper than listening to something, to the point you can't move from your place. He says, Riyah de Chochma, and dveikus is a form of rotze. So how's that consistent with what we said before? So his answer was, that the Rotze itself, there are 2 types. The Rotze of Bina is the yesh, the human being, or the neshama is yearning to reach a deeper place, a deeper experience. Here, it's completely Lizbat Legamri, and he compared it to Shemoneh Esrei. That Shemoneh Esrei, even your lips won't move. You're so taken by the experience, he says, these were the words he used. Shemoneh Esrei, he said, there's no words on my lips, on my tongue. Doesn't have the power to speak. That's why you say Adnai Sfasei Tiftach, that God should open my lips. But nevertheless, so it's called, so on one hand, it's a complete bittul, but it's also a Rotze Momata Lamaila, and he explained it. So what's the difference between the 2 rotzes? So he says it depends. I'm sorry, my mistake. The difference between rotze of Chochma and Bina is I just explained that. What's the difference in the rotze and Shuv then in Chochma? Why, on one hand, you call it rotze and dveikus, where you're cleaving to something, and the other is called Shuv, where you are, and you're experiencing it. So he says that's the difference if it's only in the mind, the Chochma experience is only affecting the mind, or also the heart. And here's what he said. I'm repeating it because it's a little subtle. He says, the exact words, this is what the Ayin Beis is citing. But here he explains it in Samach. So what did he say? He said like this. Then it's a form of Rotze. Because even in Chochma, though it's not Bina, but even in Chochma, if it hasn't really permeated the emotional experience of the person, the Chochma experience has not affected the emotion, it's still in a form of Rotze and Dveikus in an increased way. But and the heart sees, like he says, and the heart perceives. That's in the state of Shuv. Which means even in Chochma, there can be a state where it's not really permeating the person completely. He's absorbed and he's captivated. He said Riyah affects the person, he can't move, he can't speak, but nevertheless, it's still not affected the entire person, which means the heart is not sensing it yet. So and he gives the example of the Gashmis, that when you see a wise person is able to understand, is able to perceive the consequences, Haroya, he's able to see ahead. And as if he's seeing it right now. That's what he gave the example. But Reb Davar also this niggush belev dafka. So he actually feels and senses what are the consequences or the implications of a particular experience. So most people just see what they see right now. He's able to see ahead because of his wisdom. So he says that's a thing that affects the heart because it's bikiruv ki'ilu kfar ba. It's as if it happened. I gave the example with the Rebbe's letter answer about Yamit yesterday. There are many other examples. So he says, "Kamay keinu b'riyas halev, shalev margish davar asad liyas, so kamay lev yedeya moras nafshe, v'chein lehepech." That when the person feels it through and through. In other words, the Chochma hasn't just affected his intelligence; it's also affected his heart. So he says, "So in primi v'asmi davka margish halev upoil boy hazazah gdela ki'ilu hadavar kfar ba." And he's affected. In other words, he can even tremble or celebrate something that didn't happen yet, because it's so permeated him, and he so clearly sees what's going to be tomorrow, the next day, or in the future, that it's affecting him. So Navede, he says, it's greater shiftless v'bitl in a state of Shuv. Because he is so in the experience, it's affected all of him. Whereas if it was only in the mayach, it affects the mind. So it does have an effect, but in Chochma itself, it can be called more of a Rotzo rather than a Shuv. So what do we see from this? And the Rotzo is also bittul b'tachlis in contrast to the Rotzo of Bina. The Shuv kishenigrish belev gamke, and the Shuv is when it also affects the heart. So now we see in Chochma itself like two levels, but we haven't finished, because what does this mean exactly? If Chochma indeed is different than Bina, because you're in the experience, so why do we say that there's a mayach without a lev? And the answer is because Chochma has two levels, and he's going to give now an example for it in the parentheses, and I think that will cover the subject. And then I'll stop, we'll take some questions, and we'll continue back in Ayin Beis. So I'm going to read now the parentheses on page in Samach Vav. Again, the Maimer is Va'era Maimer Ki Kasher Shemaim. In the print that I'm looking at is page 149. The line begins with a parenthesis, V'yesh Lemer. This is an example for the difference between Moyach and Lev in Chochma. V'yesh Lemer Shezeu al derech mashal, which right away tells me that he says that in the parenthesis, Yeshlemer, that this piece is most likely from, I would guess, the Mittler Rebbe, but it's definitely, because the Yeshlemer, he's not saying Yeshlemer on himself, it's usually citing an idea from a previous Maimer. It could be from even the Alter Rebbe, but most likely the Mittler Rebbe, and he's now explaining it with an example. Shezeu al derech moshel. So before we got to the moshel, remember before there was an example of a king, that when a person is standing, hears about the king from a distance, it creates an excitement, a palpable excitement, but that's Rotzo. You want to be close to the king, but you're in the king's presence, it affects you the very opposite way. There's no Rotzo, you're right there, so you become completely absorbed, you're completely buttoned, you fall to the floor, he said. Like by Shemoneh Esrei. So the difference between being in the experience or hearing about the experience from a distance is the difference between Bina and Chochma. Now he's going to take the example of the king further and explain the difference between Rotzo and Shuv in Chochma. So here's a derech mashal besar, a minister. So here's the example: the king, he has ministers, which are obviously more intelligent and more refined people, and then there's the servants of the king. So he's going to contrast to how the minister experiences the king and how the servants do. So he says, Besar, Kishareis HaMelech, B'yakar Tiferes Gdulase. When he sees the king in his full glory, in the beauty or the glory of the beauty of his greatness. And of course, again, we're talking not superficial, external, that the king is wearing nice royal garments. It's all about a king that deserves the name king, representing the kingship of God in this earth. Melech David HaMelech. Moshe was considered by B'Shur Melech a king. So when a sar sees a king, and Chassidus brings the mashal of a king all the time, even if it's a secular king, because even a secular king also has an element. We make a bracha, a blessing, because God gives him a certain element of exaltedness, a certain royalty. So he says, when the sar, the minister, sees the king in his full glory, he becomes completely nullified, completely loses his own self. And he's incapable of being close. So what happens? He retreats in awe or fear, with a great awe. When he sees something of greatness, so Asar, well, that's what he does. He retreats. He stands in a very deep level of bittul and yira. V'zehu, 1 second. I'm sorry, I skipped a line. My mistake. Let me go back. I skipped the line. He says, when the sar, the minister, sees the king in his glory, it's the exact opposite. I skipped to the Eved. So erase what I just said. It was my mistake. So what happens? He becomes in a state of kiruv and dveikus yesef. He feels close and attached to the king. His soul cleaves and gets attached to the king, the king. The tevloi hadover ma'ed, and this is he feels very good about it, or this is very beneficial to him, or you could say he just enjoying and he has pleasure in this experience. So minister, who's a minister of the king and appreciates the king is coming now in glory, is coming out in his glory. The effect on the sar is that it causes a closeness to connect to it. He appreciates his good, the greatness of it, and has pleasure in it. Aval ha'eved, by contrast, a servant, gam mishu b'kirav tomid el hamelech. We're not talking about necessarily a servant that works in another part of the kingdom or palace. Even one who's constantly close to the king, meaning he serves the king, whether he serves him food or whatever it may be. The exact opposite happens. When he sees the king in his full glory, he completely gets nullified. He cannot be close to the king at all. So he retreats, nirta, literally like retreats in fear, in great awe. What's the reason for the difference? He says, because the sar, being his primary role and his primary function and his quality is, he has a great mind. That's why he's a minister. And also his appreciation of the king is an intellectual one. And his whole role is to be an advisor to the king. He's one of the advisors of the king. So he's actually in a position of, not that he's equal to the king, but he's in a position of prominence. So therefore, being someone who appreciates the king and is someone who's one of the advisors or consultants, and he's like so-called in the inner circle, so how does he react to the king's glory? With his mind, and he has pleasure in it, and he attaches himself very strongly to it. He doesn't say the word pride, but it's like he's part of the entourage. He's part of the king's team. So as the king is great, he feels connected to it. He feels attached to it. And it's all because his moyach, his main aveda is with his moyach. In aveda, that's the case. This is a moshel. But in the nimshal, the sar is someone that's serving with mind. Va'eved, on the other hand, ikrehu b'kabbalah sel. The Eved does not necessarily appreciate the king, doesn't know who he is, doesn't understand the king's intelligence. He's not one of the advisors. He serves Kabbalah Sel. He's a simple, dedicated, committed servant. Kabbalah Sel, the Kabbalah Sel who believed Dafka. And Kabbalah Sel is Dafka in the heart. It's an emotional dedication. The Sar, for example, we all know that a minister, because he's of quality, that's usually the people who mutineer against a king. Here we're not talking about someone who's rebelling, but their intelligence can also work the other way because it's an intelligent connection. It's based on logic. The Eved is just completely Kabbalah Sel, completely dedicated. It's not based on how much he understands or doesn't understand. And that's an emotional connection, not just an intellectual. So like when the Jews stood by Matan Torah, what was their connection, their appreciation of God? There's the element they appreciated God's wisdom and God's Torah, but there was also Nasiv and Nishma, that they just accepted like a child, like a servant. This is God, what God wants. So the Eved has that mile of pshittus, and that's emotional, that's in the heart, dafke. Now, this doesn't mean a sar, a minister, can't have an emotional connection, but his role and his personality is more in the Giluyim, so to speak. And the Giluyim create more of a Rotzo, he's going to explain, because then he wants to be closer to the king. And Kabbalah Sel, you're not there. All you are is to serve. So you do the job that you have to do. It's not about you getting closer to the king. It's doing what the king wants you to do. You're far more, let's call it, transparent and selfless. That's what he's leading to. So Kabbalah Sel is beloved after Lechein harihu mekabel inyan yeka gedulas hamelech. So how does he see and how does he experience the yeka gedulas hamelech, the same beautiful exaltedness or the greatness of the king? Belev. He experienced it belev in his heart. And that's why what it effect on him is not about kiruv and dveikus and getting closer and attaching. It's more of a humility, a lowliness and a humility and a selflessness. Increasingly, she'eni yachali is bekiruv klal, to the point that he can't be at all feeling any closeness at all. He can't be close. He will retreat, as he said. V'yadua, a few more lines in the parentheses, and it's known, the Chochma b'chinas bittul the Eved. Chochma is like the bittul of a servant. U'kamoy Moshe avdi, like when we say Moshe, my servant. V'hu b'yesa dafke kasher b'chinas ariyah, the Chochma ba'al alev. That's Chochma in general. But it's increasingly so when the visualization of Chochma, because here we're seeing the king, which means you're experiencing the king, but it's coming to the heart. And the heart impacts and causes the Eved much more the Kabbalah Sel and Bittul. And that comes from the depth of the heart, which is higher and greater than the pleasure in the mind. So the Sar ultimately is appreciating through his pleasure the value of the king. It would be like the difference what Chassidus talks about Simchas Torah, when we wrap the Torah and everybody dances with the Torah. Scholars, simple people, lay people, children. Because when the Torah is wrapped up, everyone's an equal. When you come in during the year in a Beis Medrash, there's a big distinction between the Talmud Chacham, the scholar, the Rosh Yeshiva, the students, the advanced students, because Moyach is part of the process, and Moyach, there's distinctions. Simchas Torah, we're told you're dancing the Etzem HaTorah, the Pshitus with Kabbalah Sel, and everybody dances equally, and you dance with your feet. You don't dance with your head. The feet lift the head. So there's a time for Avedus HaMoyach, and there's a time for Avedus HaLev. In Chochma itself, he's now distinguished between these two. So through Chochma is a very high level experience, but Chochma, you can have the Chochma impacting the heart, and that's like the Eved and the Kabbalah Sel, which causes Yira, which he says is connected to Shuv, and Chochma, if it's in the Moyach, if it's only in the mind, it affects ava and pleasure and closeness, which is a form of Rotzo and dvekus, of cleaving and attaching. The truth is you need both. Here, clearly, the advantage is to something that is more atzmi, so the Eved, in a paradoxical way, connects more with the core of the king, whereas the Sar connects more to the Giluyim and the revelations of the king. Then a few more lines I'm just going to read just to finish the topic. So he says, Ve'ech she'yeh. And regardless, however it ends up being, whatever level we're talking, lev, moyach, b'chinas shuv zeh, this level of shuv that we're talking, shemitzad zeh, shemitzad b'chinas hariyah de chochma, the shuv that is affecting the heart from the level of chochma, hu mitzad gilia er elyon shemer alov shayidei zeh nasa b'chinas shuv. That's because of a higher revelation that's rating upon him, and that causes the shuv, because it's not about him, it's not about the person yearning and longing, it's about him being absorbed in this higher experience. The rest of it is not is interesting, obviously, but it's not negated to this Ayin Beis, at least to my mind. So this is where we're stopping in Samach Vav. So now we have an understanding of what he said here. In Ayin Beis, on its own, it's very difficult to understand what this means, but now it's been clarified here in Samach Vav. So now I will pause if anybody wants to clarify things. So this explains what we just learned in Ayin Beis, and I'm going to continue after hearing any questions you may have. Go ahead, if there are questions, that is. Okay. All right, there aren't.
Well, I'll ask a question, and forgive me because this is it's very, very complicated because we're dealing with Ava and Yira before in Ayin Beis before we got to this Samach Vav to clarify that pasuk. And so my question is, there's like this alternating. We thought the Chochma brings to Yira because it's batel, it leads to a bittul, and so you have a Yira, and Bina relates more to you, so you can have more of a Ava because you can be grateful for how it relates to you. But then in here he did in the sub comment, this almost a flip, if you will. So what happens to Avas Hashem, if you're if you're going into such great bittul that you're in Chochma and you're trying to yearn for Elokus, and to the point where you're the shiflus and you're an Eved, and basically you've really humbled yourself, and then okay, great, so you've reached, it seems like, the ideal state. Now I know you said you need both, but what happens to Avas Hashem in the midst of that striving?
What happens to Avos? Forget about Chochma, just in general. There's two mitzvahs in the Torah. One is called loving God, and one is called awe of God. So just ask the same question. When you're in awe of God, what happens to your love of God? Forget about this whole discussion of Chochma and Bina. It's not a chiddush of Ayin Beis or Samach Vav. The Torah has two mitzvahs. One is to love God, v'haftas Hashem lekecha, Hashem lekecha tira. So these are two forms of experiencing godliness, just like what happened when a person is putting on tefillin. It's a different hamshacha when they're wearing tzitzis, or Shabbos and Yom Tov. Ava and Yira are two mitzvahs. They're two different experiences. One is more through closeness and feeling close, like we said, when you contemplate in Bina, it's in one form. In Chochma, it's a different form. But these are just two emotional experiences. And I mean, can a person have Ava and Yira together? Some of my Chassidus talk about that, but it's fine to say there's two tracks. He said even if. Now, the difference is in Bina, like we said, there's two different contemplations, and they both two different expressions. In Chochma, it's a divine experience, and the words he uses, lepamim, sometimes it comes in Ava, I'm reading straight from Ayin Beis right now. So I would suggest reading, now that we learned in Samach Vav, let's go back to Ayin Beis. So he says, they both come from the divine experience. And he says like this, at times it comes in the form of Ava and Dveikus. That, and sometimes it comes in the form of Yira. And what's the difference? If the Hergish is in the mind, so then, it's more of an Ava, Dveikus Rotzo, as we just explained in Samach Vav, like more like the Sar, the minister experience. If you Hergish believe, then it's in the form of Shuv, Yira, more like the servant experience of seeing the divine glory. So that's that. That's it. I mean, whether you could have Ava and Yira together is another discussion.
That's really my question, I guess.
Well, it's not really a discussion here. That would need to be looking at other Maimarim where they discuss that point. Here it's fine. It's two separate tracks. It's like two mitzvahs. Okay. And there are different times. You do different mitzvahs, just like in davening. Okay, good.
All right. In Pashtus, as a practical matter, at times you're in Yira and at times you're in Ahava of Hashem. Is that the bottom line?
Yeah, that's the two mitzvahs, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to continue now after the Samach Vav parentheses, 7 lines from the bottom of page 1234 in Ayin Beis now. So love and awe come from inyan echad, one experience, one divine experience. Imu b'mayach or b'lev, dependent if it's in the mind. In other words, the Chochma experience is affecting primarily the mind, or also the heart, or the heart. If he doesn't say also, before he said also the heart. Okay. If there are no other questions, I'm going to continue from the Bechain. So now he continues. Bechain, another distinction between Chochma and Bina experience, between the Yesh experience and Ayin, both appreciating godliness, but one is you're in the experience, like I said, more like a noun, a state of being, and Bina is more like a verb, an action, where you're understanding and appreciating, and therefore yearning and longing or experiencing awe from different contemplations. So he says, Hiskalus chen hiskalus amidus. And so too, the interconnectivity of emotions, ze im ze, one with another, hu mibchinas chochma dafke. That specifically comes through chochma. Now you could say, 1 second, didn't we just learn the previous paragraph that it comes from Bina? He said, Bina creates his chalkus, the gamshe is skalus. And it says, Mukom Mokom Gamkin is skalus amidish, Shemitzad Seichel, because Seichel Bina compels us to know that you need to have chesed and gvura. But if you look, he said his skalus, he said that comes, however, his skalus that comes after his chalkus. That the Seichel understands many different details. And then that Seichel understands the distinction, and then it comes, Iskalus Zegufa Ideis Chalkus. But the true Iskalus comes when the Midas are not just to make sense that they should work with one with another, but the fundamental connection. So if you remember in the parentheses, that's back in the previous paragraph, he said, Habitl v'achlishus ba'mida, be'etzem li'is neisen mokel l'mida, is dafka from Chochma. So there's a few things in Iskalus Hamidus. One is, obviously, it's like having a team. Let's say you're the head of it, you're a team leader in a company. And you understand that each one of them has their role to play. You explain it to them. Everyone's working together. Beautiful. That's a logical, strategic approach where you have different people with different strengths complementing each other. Or like a musical, like an orchestra. However, Hiskalus is a deeper aspect to Hiskalus, and that is the mere fact that different things join together, and even though each have their own strengths, that they have a certain bittul. A bittul that they recognize, not just logically, that they have the humility to recognize that they're all part of a greater whole. So in Bina, though there's also an element of bittul, obviously, but like he said, the real bittul is from Chochma. So that's why the truest scholars ultimately, especially as them working as one, mamish as one, not just cooperative, different forces at one, that comes dafka from Chochma. And we learned that length earlier. And he's referring to the Maimarim he mentioned before. He mentioned two Maimarim, Vayash Kolov and Boiker V'Yadei Hashem. Both Ashlach and Kairach Maimarim back in volume 1. If you look below, volume 1, page, basically pages 527 and on, and 520 and 2, and page 522 and on, discuss this at length. He says it comes dafke from Chochma, that what they skals from Shema the Chochma. So Chochma we know is the letters koyach ma, the power of what? Ma in Hebrew indicates v'nochnu ma, what? Indicates a level of bittul. As a matter of fact, Moshe, the letters Moshe, is mem hey with a shin in middle. It's a level of bittul. So Chochma is ultimate bittul, as we discussed yesterday, in the world of consciousness, in the structure of the 10 spheres. Chochma is the first of the spheres, and as we learned many times, it's a state of bittul. If you recall, even here in volume 3, if you recall the difference between Reishis and Rishon, and I'll refer you to what page that is. So he spoke about the difference between Keser and Chochma. So he said the following, page 1215. So he said that Keser is complete nullification. There's nothing altogether. And that's why it's a Yud, does not have a shape even. The Yud of Chochma at least has some form, some shape. It's not a hey, but it's a dot. So on page 1215 and 1216, he spoke about somewhat the bittul of Chochma. And he spoke how it's the beginning of the spheres, and therefore everything starts with there. And then Bina, if you remember on top of page 1216, he said Bina's mitzayer tziyurim. So in the Chochma is the point that begins. Bina designs or draws shapes and forms from the Nekuda of Chochma, which he spoke about on the top of page 1216. Okay. So Chochma is Ma, and the bittul of Ma is the power that gives the power to create a scholus of the Midas. Now this is the Liya Chochma hu b'chinas Ayin u bittul, being that Chochma is the level of Ayin and bittul, not Yesh. Ayin, the nullification, the suspension of self. And it also therefore impacts the bittul also in the midas, like we learned. Bina can't impact such bittul. It can't transform the midas because Bina is a yesh. Bina is part of the experience of the person. Bina gives birth to the midas. It harnesses them, refines them, elevates them, guides them. But bittul gamba midas liya is b'chinas kalus, that they should be in a state of complete interconnectivity. It's like looking at the human body. So many different organs, so many different faculties, different cells, and yet it works together in a healthy person in such a coordinated way. It's not just a logical thing because they all understand, every limb understands that it needs each other. There's some fundamental message, like an invisible conductor, that's coordinating it all and creates a bittul in all of them that they all understand they're part of something bigger. And that's why there's that deep interconnectivity. The world of Toyu, as explained in those Maimarim back in volume 1, is the antithesis to that. There are many strong faculties. There's Chochma, and there's Bina, and so on. But they're all so intense, they don't work with each other. They don't leave room for each other, space for each other, and they definitely don't cooperate with each other, which is why ultimately Toyu is the world of chaos, or the world where there was the shattering of the containers. Too intense. Whereas Iskalulus comes from the Ma, the bittul of Chochma. Okay. Now, the Rabbi Rashab doesn't elaborate because he did elaborate at length in volume 1. It's pages and pages about this. I'm talking about pages, I'm talking about 40, 50 pages probably on this topic alone. And then in his scholars, he spoke many different levels. What's relevant to us here is the distinction between Bina and Chochma in the Mutfa Murgish Muskel journey of development and growth of a human being's emotions and cognitive abilities, especially in the context of serving God. So Chochma is therefore a far higher level of experience than Bina is. Now, we're going to go to parentheses, which is again pretty dense. So I'll go slowly and explain it. But since any questions right now, or we continue?
I have another question. I'm sorry, I'm second question today, but if you reach this level of Chochma where the midos are essentially batul and they're sort of subjugate or they're subordinated because of the bitul, it's almost like they melt. I mean, the image I'm getting is them melting into Chochma. And then if you reach that point, then how do you single them out and how do you express chesed, gvura, whatever, if they're so batul that they almost lose their distinct identity? Whereas it seemed like with Bina, there was this Chalkus and there's Hiskalus, and then at least they remained distinct. And yes, with Hiskalus and Bina, they were able to coordinate with each other. They were able to recognize each other.
Well, the example I've given. I gave 3 examples for this. One is when you stand in awe and completely absorbed with a wonder, a natural wonder, let's say. A second, music, where you're completely absorbed in the song. And the third, reading a book. So what's happening here is the subject and the object have become one. You're not even able to be conscious to talk about it because you're now in the moment and completely absorbed. So there are experiences going on. It's just you're not feeling them. Ava is one, like he said, lapomim, it comes in a form of ava, which would be that part of the experience is very deep closeness to the experience. If you were to analyze it afterwards, or someone from the outside was watching this person who's absorbed, it may express itself in that. It may express itself in a form of awe and yira. So it's not about really documenting it. It's just that the full human being, I wouldn't use the word subordinate at all, frankly. I use the word absorbed. I use the word that all of the person is so part of the Chochma experience that all their being, their chesed, gvura, and everything is all now on that level. And there are experiences, except the person is not going to be able to talk about them because they're so absorbed, they're not into it. If you, again, were able to dissect it, and when it does become, afterwards, let's say the person comes out of this trance state, they can then describe some of what they experienced. So you'll find different emotional reactions. But it's not, the focus is not on emotions as they're sensed and tangible. The focus is on the experience where you're not even feeling or definitely not conscious of what's going on at the moment.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay, so now he continues in the parentheses. Okay. So I need to go back to something we learned earlier. If you recall, we talked about the tzirufim on the same page, 1234. You go back to the top of the third of the page. There was a parenthesis where he said that Bina is a divider. Bina breaks things down. The Chochma is a uniter. Chochma is a nekuda, it's a kernel, it's a seed. Bina develops it. Like pregnancy develops the seed that fertilizes the egg, and then it starts developing into a full fetus. So he said that part of this, that Bina power to divide and separate things, because it's bringing down the godliness into structure. Chochma is bringing the structure into godliness, if you wish. And Bina is bringing the godliness into the structure. So he said also that the chalkus of Bina also is in the very letters of thought and speech. He says, V'chene chalkus, I'm reading the parentheses, like 10 lines from the top of the page. that the very distinction of letters in thought and speech, because they're made up of letters. When you speak, there are letters. And when you think, they're also letters. You may not feel them, but there's a point where thought has letters. It comes from the severities, it comes from the disciplines, if you wish, the strengths of ima, bina. The hey gvuras of mansapach. And he says, so when a person is breaking down an idea into details in bina, each part of this breakdown has its own structure. Like you can write, let's say, a section or a chapter on each specific thing, and it has its own siruf, which siruf means combination and of the different phrases or words or ideas or letters even. So he says, so these sirufim, a siruf means a combination of letters. They enclose and manifest the idea. So when you're thinking in an organized way of an idea, the thought says, okay, here's the beginning of the idea, the middle, the conclusion, different breakdowns, and so on. So this is made up of tzirufim. Tzirufim is different combinations. But in Bina, the focus is breaking it down into structures. So for example, if you were to make a business plan, when you write a business plan, or any type of proposal of that sort, the Kudas HaChochma is going to be this summary, the executive summary, or even furthermore, the headline, if you wish. Bina is going to be the breakdown, the sections of this plan. Each section has its own purpose. They all together work together to create one big plan. But if you only had Chochma, you would not be able to convey this plan to anybody. You just wrote one word or you just wrote one sentence, it wouldn't be enough. On the other hand, Bina breaks it down, but Bina is driven by the unifying Chochma that keeps it honest and keeps it on track and makes sure that all the details are aligned with the ultimate purpose of it all. So just like Bina creates the siruf, the breakdown, Schalkus, he's now going to talk about how Chochma creates the unity. That when you, for example, right now I'm speaking, so it's true, I'm saying actual words. For example, I say I just said these and these words. So on one hand, you need to have actually letters that become words, but you're not hearing a bunch of letters. You're hearing a phrase that you can relate to because we understand language. But if you step back for a moment and say it's a pretty wondrous thing that someone can speak, it's made up of a bunch of different letters. The letters are combined into words, the words combined into a sentence. And at the same time that they're broken down into specific phrases and words and letters, yet there's one message being conveyed. And you don't even have to put effort to do that. You're not sitting and like you do, let's say, when you decipher an anagram, or what do they call it? You know, where words are jumbled together. So there you have to work and unjumbling them and turning them into organized order. Here, the mind naturally takes all the letters I'm saying and the words and phrases and sees it as one message or part. Now you could break it down into details, or you could experience the whole message as one. That's already the difference between Chochma and Bina and Chochma. Now, he's going to discuss now how Chochma role is in this form of expressions, where Bina breaks it down, Chochma connects. So here's what he says. It's a very fascinating piece. The tziruf, not the breakdown, the tziruf, the combination. Like we see a person doesn't need to put any intention. You don't have to put any deliberate effort. Like when I'm speaking right now, I'm not thinking, okay, let me first figure out which letters am I going to use? Which words am I going to use? And then combine them together. I'm speaking now. I'm naturally communicating an idea because speech has the element of, yes, a breakdown, but there's something that also comes naturally that you don't need any kavana, echlet tzara fa'esis. So he explains this further. He says like this now. Maybe if everybody could put on mute. I hear there's some background music. Okay. She says, Shahare, how to manifest an idea in what structure and what combinations. For that, you may need at times a plan. You need to organize yourself because you have an idea and you want to know how you're going to express that idea. Should I use these and these terms and phrases? Top of page 1235. Or am I going to use different forms of expression? So when a person is, let's say, preparing to give a speech or preparing a class, there are different ways to express an idea. So that at times, he says, needs kavanah. It needs preparation. You need to deliberately an intention. Why does he say lepamim? Because for a person who's a good speaker or a person who knows ideas well, they can develop it as they're speaking. They don't need to sit and figure out, okay, this class I'm going to use in these examples. As the ideas flow, it comes to them naturally. But at times, and maybe it'd even be better at times, where a person does determine which phrases am I going to use to explain the idea. So that can at times need kavanah. But when he actually is expressing a word and letters and they're turning into words, we're not talking about which words you use. Which words, you can explain something 5 different ways. You see that all the time. Chassidus sometimes brings an example that a Sfara, the Ran explains it with certain words, the Rashba or Rashi or someone else explains it with different words. So that's regarding what's a word, but the very tzirufim themselves, there you don't see anyone has to sit down and say, okay, how am I going to express the word atzilus? It just comes naturally. The very combination of the letters, that does not need any deliberate intent. In other words, it's like when you're going to go and build something, build a house, you're going to go build any structure or draw something or write something. You need to think it through and plan it. But when you express in words, and speaking now speech, he says, can we just get everybody on mute here?
Yeah,
Okay. So he says, so what's the reason for that? How is it that it's coming so naturally, smooth like water flowing? Person just speaks. You have a conversation. We're talking about a conversation that wasn't planned. You don't need to make any effort. As long as God blesses you with the power to speak clearly, you speak. The words come together, the letters come together naturally and easily. So he says, because it's coming from Chochma, Shalamayla Mahadas Va'akavona. Remember, Chochma is like Riyah, clarity, a certain truth that's higher than Das and Kavona. Das meaning, and Kavona meaning intentional concentration. Chochma does not require that. Who Inyan Abba Yosad Brata. So his expression is Zoyad, Abba Chochma, Yosad, establishes Brata is Bas. In Aramaic, it means the daughter. Brata is Malchus, Dibur. So Abba, in other words, Dibur comes from Chochma, basically. Shemesham Etzem Mahusa Asius, Mibchinas Kadmus HaSeichel. I'll explain Kadmus HaSeichel in a moment. From there come the core essence of the letters that a human being uses, and he calls it Kadmus HaSeichel from the primordial, from the earliest levels of Seichel, before Seichel has become structured and conscious. So Chassidus is a Gersa Kedesh, I think based on Eitz Chaim and other places, says that the letters that a person uses are not created when you speak. They are rooted in the Kadmus HaSeichel in a certain unconscious or superconscious state of intelligence. That's why children learn to speak so easily. It doesn't take years. They obviously listen to their parents and to the adults around them speaking. That's why if you have parents who speak French, the children are speaking French, or Hebrew or English and so on. But the very ability to compose words, so yes, it takes time. We see how cute it is. Children first begin to say their first few words. But if you think about it, you go to school 12 years, 14 years to learn all kinds of things. The very ability to speak takes months, a year maybe, and a child is speaking perfectly. They may not have the whole repertoire of words yet that they need to learn, but the ability to communicate comes relatively easy. And many scientists and child psychologists try to figure out why. What is it that a person has that just naturally speaks easily? And look, just to drive the point home, you don't see that ability in other species. Yes, a parakeet, a parrot, certain creatures can copy, mimic words and sounds. And yes, animals have their own language, but the language is more through sounds. You don't see animals, even if you were there around human beings, they wouldn't just pick up speech. They wouldn't just start speaking. And again, they have their own form of communication. It could be sophisticated too. Because the way Kabbalah explains it is because letters are part of the very soul of a human being. They're there. Not that they're letters hanging around there. The capacity to take an idea and put it into words and letters is natural to a human being. It's not acquired. What's acquired is the language, is the form of expression, the actual words. Like he said, to know what to choose, what words to choose in given situation. But the very ability to combine letters into words comes from Chochma, which is etzem uhusa esis, from kadmus haseichel. It's higher than das and kavanah. Das and kavanah is needed when you're deliberately teaching someone in a way where you need to train them. Training takes time and effort, and that's exactly what you're, because it's acquired knowledge. Letters and the combination of letters are not acquired. They come from Chochma, and Chochma is a unifier, not a divider. So the Bina creates the distinction of letters and words and so on, but Chochma creates the tziruf, the very tziruf, the combination. Let me just finish the parentheses. And from that level of kadam sasecha, the letters also comes that tziruf, the combination of letters. Let's say the word baruch, Beis, Reish, Vav, Chaf, which means blessing, and so on. Like it says elsewhere. Now, let me just read this last two lines just to complete the parentheses, but this is going to need more explanation. And earlier, the Maimer Vayas Kolov, which he cited before on the previous page, about Iskalolus and the role of Chochma and Bina, Nizboir, that this ability to combine, Zeo Mishlemus Bechinas Meichin Dianika. Remember we talked about Yanika, Ibr Yanika Meichin? So this ability to combine comes from when a person matures to the point of Meichin Dianika, which of course is the age when a child learns to speak. When the completion, when you see a child, not the beginning stage, when a child learns to speak completely, not all the words, but a very clear, able to completely express themselves like an adult, that's the level of Shlemus Meichin Dianika. Because here it would seem, if it's coming from Chochma, Chochma is already muskal. There's mutva, murgish, muskal. Ibur Yanika Meichin, it's coming from Meichin. So the Rebbe Rashab is qualifying and saying, nevertheless, there too it explains that this comes from Chai Shebemedaber. This level of Shlemus, Chai Shebemedaber. But this I'm going to leave for tomorrow to explain what that is. We have to go back to Vayas Kolov. So he's just being thorough and completing the picture here. So bottom line is, this parenthesis came to cover another aspect that Chochma accomplishes, which again is a uniter. And it's also like this intangible, because words and letters are very tangible. But the combination that it comes so smoothly and easily for us to just express words, we're not talking about which words you use for which idea. but just to express ourselves is a Chochma type of manifest experience. Okay. We're going to stop here by this parenthesis, but if anybody wants to ask anything, please.